thank you all so much for being a part of this. I don't think that either of you have interacted with each other, but I know you all individually as just like really amazing, strong women. So I hope that this can continue some sort of a friendship or something beyond this panel, because you're all doing such amazing work. And so first of all, thank you. Thank you for the work that you do. And thank you for being a part of this space and for agreeing to have a conversation with each other. And I wanted to bring you all together to share, this conversation is all about living resistance, and how we can continue to tap into these wellness practices that sometimes people forget, their ancestral practices. There are things that people have been doing for many, many generations. And somehow we've, managed to lose tap with a lot of those things. And so it's a matter of that resurgence, of bringing that energy back and feeling comfortable in these spaces that sometimes can feel very uncomfortable. So let's get into the conversation. I have so many questions for all of you. First of all, I want to start off with each of you introducing yourselves.
Hi, everyone. My name is Claudia Serrato. I am a professor over at Cal Poly Pomona and at Casa Dominguez Hills. I am specifically a culinary anthropologist. I've been working with indigenous communities throughout Turtle Island, working alongside some powerful chefs doing revitalization and regeneration work, specifically around plant-based indigenous foods. And I've been an active member and participant of the Decolonizing the Diet and Re-indigenization movements since 2007.
I'm so happy to be here. My name is Dania Cabello. I'm based up in Oakland, California. And it's hard for me sometimes to answer the question, what do I do? Because I do a lot of things. And sometimes they can seem like they're in different spheres. But they're all a part of what I call my soul system. And so I'm trained as a former professional athlete. I'm a sports and education pedagogue. I think about theories of freedom and how that relates to the ways that we learn and we move. As a trained athlete, my journey of healing and wellness led me to indigenous plant medicine as a way to reclaim my wellness after years of pro sports beating my body down. And I recently founded and launched in the highly regulated cannabis industry my topicals medicine, which is all body care for pain and inflammation using plant medicine, and kind of using the soul system of play, sport, movement, and indigenous connection to both healing and the ways that we find joy back into our lives. And so that's a little bit of the spheres that I weave together in my practices.
Sounds amazing. I'll go ahead and jump in next. My name is Adriana Alejandre, and I am based in Los Angeles, California, specifically in the San Fernando Valley. But my work is national. Here in Burbank, I am a trauma psychotherapist. My license is in marriage and family therapy, but I focus on individuals that experience any form of trauma, and I focus on EMDR work with them. I use a very collaborative approach as well, but I supervise, I mentor other Latinx therapists or therapists of color as well, here in LA, but also again nationally. I'm the founder of Latinx Therapy, which is a global bilingual podcast and a national directory where folks can find a Latinx therapist, or 98% actually of our directory is Spanish speaking. So a Spanish speaking therapist as well. And we do a lot of national projects. The whole mission of Latinx therapy is to destigmatize mental health and provide culturally competent services.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, you all are so amazing. I'm so honored to be here with you. And I want to start off with a question that's for all of you. which is sort of a general but kind of loaded question, because a lot of times when our communities think about wellness, we think about it as a privilege because not everybody has the opportunity to focus on the good things that center their well-being, right? And there's so many levels of intersectional oppression that are happening, especially in low-income communities of color, that oftentimes don't give people the opportunity to focus on their wellness, their well-being, their indigenous and ancestral practices. So what are your thoughts on all of these? I mean, I know it's a loaded question, but I think it's something that we're all trying to work on.
Well, I'd be happy to jump in. That question stood out to me as somebody who, on paper, most of my life was participating in very active wellness practices in the realm of sports. And it took kind of ending my professional career as an athlete to apply critical awareness to that space of quote unquote wellness, to realize just how much harm I had learned and was inflicted on my body because of the norms that sports kind of prescribes for us, whether it be patriarchy, whether it be abuse of our bodies, and the things that I witness in that sphere of wellness. And so, one of the things that I kind of with this question, when I think about wellness, is also the ability for us to be critical of the wellness practices that we're fed. And everything from who's teaching us to what were the foundations of those practices that were intended to healthy body, healthy mind. Because in reality, there's just too many athletes that I know firsthand whose bodies are just not healthy, even though it looks like they are, and their minds are not healthy. So when I think about kind of these systems of oppression that impact us, I think the more deeply we can become critical of these kinds of wellnesses and ask different questions of these practices that are deemed wellness, I think that it gets us to a deeper, more thoughtful approach to how do we combat patriarchy in sports as a practice of our collective wellness.
I want to piggyback off of that as well, because I am thinking about the colonial impact. And also to how it is defined, right? So again, who defines wellness? What is wellness, right? It's very situated within a European Western dominant discourse. And, so when I think about wellness, my first instinct is to unpack that, right? Well, what do we mean by wellness? Because wellness to you, Jocelyn, could mean something very different to somebody else. And so, yes, it was just shared, right? It's not just a one size fits all, right? Wellness is very culturally situated, which is something we don't see, right? Because that's not just part of the dominant, wellness community, right? Like it's not situated within that. And two, right, there are ecological dimensions that are not always part of the conversation, right? So when we think of wellness, we think of just ourselves. It's very just one person, and it takes away from those indigenous realities that there's an ecology, right? So how do we begin to think about ecological wellness? And that means we need to disrupt these colonial narratives that define what is wellness, what does it look like, what am I supposed to look like when I'm well, versus well, how do I work with this, right? Like, how do I, maybe even give thanks for some differences that I have, right? Whereas somebody else would diagnose it as a bad thing. You need to be on medication. Well, how do I, as an indigenous person, kind of see that a little differently as well, perhaps it's a gift that I have. And perhaps, there are other methods to provide that medicine that I need, working on the landscape.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's so much with what you're both saying that I noticed, I feel like I'm fairly green into my field of psychology. I got my license in 2017, and as soon as I got it and I was on my own, I knew something was wrong. Like I knew that the way that I had been trained was not fitting with my clients of color. And that is really why a lot of my work started, because I felt gaslit by the systems. And I'm at a point now, what are we on, 2020? 3 years later, where I feel like I'm dumping my education. All of those theories, kind of like how, well, exactly what Dania was saying, who created these, right? These foundations were created by white men, all of psychology. So, you know, a lot of our families, my family is, they're immigrants from Mexico and Guatemala. And even in their own countries, there's a lot of stigmas. But coming here to America just further gaslights a lot of communities of colors, ideas and own practices of what wellness is. Back in the days, I don't know what year, but when people would see therapists, Latinx folks specifically would see therapists for grieving. And if they were to say something like, I can hear the voice of my loved one, they would be diagnosed schizophrenic. So our field has history of pathologizing, and there is still so much missing in terms of training therapists, you know, that are being trained by these systems of no color, essentially, by these colonial and westernized systems that need a lot of help. They need us really to kind of just educate them on the fact that no, I mean, they fixed that in our DSM and our diagnosis manual, but people are still teaching that. People are still missing that piece, that there's a lot of cultural components from our history that leads us into our own wellness practices. Us hearing voices of our loved ones helps us heal.
Wow, you all are all like bringing so much to the surface that I think oftentimes in these conversations of wellness rarely ever come up. You know, a lot of times we have this notion of what wellness means. You know, for somebody who's a yoga practitioner, like Dania mentioned, it might be, you know, getting their yoga certification in Bali and having that moment of their own self, like emergence in their wellness, right? And then what does that mean when they then come back? You know, how do we still integrate things like that into our community? So I want to circle back to Dania and the work that you're doing in the soccer space and the football space. You know, you are creating space for youth in the community to really come together and have a safe space that really cultivates joy, a space where you can really work through trauma, you know, that's different. You know, Adriana, you were just saying, like, a different way to work through that trauma may be to not go directly to medication, but find ways to cope with it in a way that seems unconventional to a lot of people. So Dania, tell us about the work that you're doing in the soccer space.
Yeah, so it's been almost 10 years now. Ago, I had founded a sports program called Futbolistas for Life. And this was a small program in East Oakland that, because we had no soccer field to play on, we actually had a little bit more freedom to get creative with what soccer practice meant for the young folks. Together, we kind of co-created a program where, you know, all these principles of justice and kind of critical thinking that are taught in other classes, like in your history class, or one would hope, or like the ethnic studies class. My question was, why isn't sports taught that way? Why do we go through being critical in every class, but the second it comes to our own bodies, we lack criticality? And my job was, all right, I'm educated by a certain field, which was like academia. It's not the only or most important field of education, but that was my training. And my thought was, how do I make this relevant and pertinent using language that my students would enjoy and understand? And so we created a way to play, definitely influenced by like other athletes and movers and groups that I've been a part of. But we created a soccer program where being critical and understanding the ways our bodies move through and with oppression so that we could liberate ourselves and claim space and center our joy as just parts of, I used to call it resistance, but I actually now am in resistance to saying resistance. I actually think it's a part of our flow. Because when we're alive and we're breathing and we're healthy, that is with the natural flow of being connected to the earth, of understanding ourselves as part of nature. And so through that practice, and I'll be my first critic. We built a soccer field. It was amazing. We got lots of love from it. However, you can't just go build a soccer field in any urban city or rural town. The amount of privilege, access to money, funding, space, land is not replicable. So the work that I've shifted towards in 10 years from being kind of like, yes, wanting to celebrate the good things that we've done, but also how can we make it replicable and shareable, is actually through freestyle soccer, where we activate spaces around the town, around any city outside a bank that weren't meant for play. And we bring our play, we bring our music and our balls and our joy. And that alone transforms the space. It centers us as moving beings who are not always centered, whether it be in spaces of play or let alone in like commercial financial districts, downtown San Francisco. And so the idea is to, with my work in sports, is to encourage people to move beyond the system. So like, you don't need a team of 11 people to get moving. You can find ways to move with your soccer ball, to flow with it. And when you bring a ball into public spaces, the amount of human connection and joy that's exchanged with people walking by, the grandmother bringing their child home from school, it creates this whole other ecosystem of love that I never really experienced in that way in traditional sports. And so a lot of my work now centers that of take ownership of your own movement and wellness practices and make it visible. Doesn't always have to be visible, because wellness and healing can be a really personal, private journey, but also to normalize the fact that we are publicly healing and that we are publicly well. And also considering our different physical abilities. Like I think often about how many people don't feel safe working out in a gym for different reasons. How many people were not invited to play on the soccer basketball team? And how many people physically can't play soccer in the way that it's supposed to because you're in a wheelchair? Where do you play? And so the idea is to create spaces that break down the limitations of these, confines of like, sport happens like this, wellness looks like this. And by just actively doing it and moving it, we are kind of creating the environment that we want. So that's my work now, is much less about like what we do in the classroom. And now the world and the streets have become my classroom. They're where I learn most. They're where I teach best. And it fits within my own philosophy of having gone through, I'm relatively young, I'm definitely young at heart. I can't run anymore. And when I think about it too hard, it makes me really sad that I hurt myself so much that I can't do something I love. And so the cannabis medicine, right? I totally neglected to mention the name of my company because, it's funny to think about this practice I've done for so many years as a company. That's not ever why I got into this. So Ojo de la Sol, there's never a time that I don't use my own medicine prior to working out, after working out, and trying to figure out now in life, when play and sports can be so intergenerational. And I've spent a lot of my time focusing on young folks. Right now, especially during the pandemic, I've shifted towards my elders. I can't always touch and hug and hold and none of that right now. And so in what ways are we creating pathways for our elders to learn old/new ways of caring for themselves and being mobile and stretching out the lower back? So that's kind of a weaving of these questions. Thank you for asking.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I really love the idea of using public space as a classroom, especially right now in light of everything that's happening and the much needed uprising that's being led by Black Lives Matter community members and what it means to reimagine public safety. And for me, that means that we're in the street, being a community of people who know each other, who greet each other, who ask how we're doing. It's so important to our overall wellness and to this feeling of placekeeping, placemaking. What is home? Home should be a community. It shouldn't just be a place where you go alone into your place and not really integrate into the other families and people who are a part of our everyday life. So I really love what you're doing, Dania. And I want to circle into what you are starting to talk a little bit about, because you are a medicine woman. You are absolutely a medicine woman in the work that you're doing with Ojo de la Sol and your cannabis work, and really using these ancestral remedies to bring back, to like resurface the things that our ancestors have been doing for generations. So how do you encourage the community to use cannabis in a way that's like a regular self-care routine?
First, I'd say just educate yourself. Some people like to smoke it, and that produces a high that many people don't want. Some people ingest it through tinctures, gotas. Some people like taking edibles. My field is in topicals, and it's really niche. It's there's still like not too much understood and known about it from kind of people who don't have a background in cannabis. And so, especially my elders, where there's some taboo, one of the ways, one of the selling points, for lack of a better word, of engaging with cannabis as a topical is that it's not psychoactive. However, it is a really strong anti-inflammatory when it has THC. So the trick is that right now there's a lot of language out there around CBD, which is one really important component in cannabis that can do wonders when ingested and eaten and taken as oils. However, topically, our skin receives medicine really differently than when you consume something. When you ingest something. And so beginning to retouch yourself, right? If you're rubbing a pomada onto your skin, there are times where people have even lost that practice of self-touch. And one of the things it invites, because I'm never going to say that, oh, wear this pomada and all of your 26 years of arthritis will go away. No, but it may be that you need to rub it out. And as you start rubbing, you may be inclined to start stretching. These are very fundamental, right? Because you can't start working out if you don't stretch, but you can't stretch if you don't know what needs stretching. So it's an invitation to pay attention to your body. And that's kind of one of the ways in which cannabis, wearing it on your points of pain and inflammation, can help one remember how to get back into their body.
Speaking to this plant medicine, I want to transition to talk a little bit more with Claudia and your work, because you are also, a healer in your own right, and doing this with your plant medicine, which is really looking at, food, mostly plant-based food, as medicine for community members. And, I always mention to people that the reason I went vegan was because I went to your indigenous veganism workshop, and literally that day turned to a friend and said, I'm going plant-based starting today. And that was really the beginning of, the work that I'm doing with Todo Verde. So you are a big foundation to the work that I do. And you're an educator, you are an anthropologist, you're a scholar, all of the a femtor. So I want you to talk a little bit about the work that you do with your plant-based medicine, your plant-based food, and how that impacts your community.
When I started this work, this was, I was still, in grad school, and I began to really think about my family. I began to think about my future, and I felt a sense of hopelessness, because I was told that because my family had a history of diabetes and had a history of heart disease and cancer, that I was prone to right, experiencing this. And I thought, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. That it's like I have no agency, I have no power. I'm like powerless in my future, right? Like I'm doomed to these particular food-related diseases. And for me, right, I knew that something had to be done. But in order for it to be done, and at a local level, I had to return to my home, which is my body, right? Because it's what I live in. It's my temple. And, it was something that I had to negotiate in thinking about my culture, also too, in thinking about the impact colonization has had, specifically on my cultural foodways, because for a moment, I was mad at my food. I was mad at the food I grew up with, because I thought, well, why are you harming me? Why is it that these indigenous foods are harming me? But in fact, it wasn't the indigenous foods that were doing the harm. It was the foods that were introduced that was becoming harmful to me, like sugars, just these different types of white products and processed foods. And then, again, right, this diet really emphasized on heavy meat and animalized consumption. And, right, like for me, I understood that my wellness was gonna, kind of become a butterfly effect in outside of my body, which was, again, my homescape. And so when I began to really address and speak on ways we can begin to decolonize our diets, I began to really focus in on how we decolonize our taste buds, right? Because ultimately what we crave is what we're going to eat. And so I began to really return to indigenous foods, but the food itself, right? And then I began to realize that the food itself also had stories. The food itself had knowledge, right? It carried and it transcended and it shared it with me. And I began to embody this knowledge. I became more aware of my landscape relations, the impact the sun had on the food that I was ingesting, right? And to the energy and the other plants that were around the foods that I was eating, and that impact. So I began to write about this. And then I began to put those writings into recipes, and I began to reclaim my home-based recipes that I grew up with. And I realized it wasn't that hard to do. I began to take away and identify those ingredients that were impacting and getting my family and our communities sick. And then I began to also look at the other ingredients that were also creating harm to the earth, right? And so really making that land, body, land connection. And so I went public with this. And at first there was a lot of resistance, and not in a good way, right? It was just like, well, what do you mean decolonizing the diet? Like, who does that? And how do you do that? And again, it is a mindset. It is a spiritual experience, right? But it began with understanding the colonial history of food. And I did that work. I had to do it in order for me to really understand what does it mean to truly decolonize. And luckily for me, because I am connected and interwoven with a really strong community here in Los Angeles, back in 2007 and 2008, I was doing a lot of work. I was teaching how to reclaim our recipes. I was teaching how to, rethink about food and nutrition, and going back with Dania, right? Thinking about indigenizing our fitness as well, right? How do we do that? And how do we become fit in the kitchen? And movement and living and being boundaryless. And so with that, I realized that what it really took was for community to taste the food. And once the community began to taste the food, I noticed that there was a form of activation that was occurring. And for me, it was ancestral memory, genetic memory, epigenetic memory, however you want to call it or identify it. And I began to see that there was an awakening. And so I decided to pursue that. And at the same time, while I was doing that, I realized, or I came back to the inner chef in me, because as a child, I always cooked, always cooked. That was like my thing, And so I began to build community with indigenous chefs throughout the country. And together, collectively, we began to talk about, well, what does it mean to decolonize the diet through, indigenous foodways? So that meant we had to really build a relationship with indigenous foodways. And at first, I used to think, oh, it's just, kitchen work and the food, right? But it was more than that. It was understanding the stories that the food carries. It was understanding their resiliency. It was also understanding land terroir, right? Which speaks to the flavors that are in the soil of this food. And then too, right, the cultural stories and the ecological knowledge that came with this food, right? So it was like, whoa, these are my teachers. Food became my teacher. And then, right, through that engagement and that interaction with the embodiment that I myself sustain and carry, right, there was a conversation happening, and then co-creation occurred, which was recipes and meals. And through these recipes and these meals, right, alongside indigenous chefs, we began to reclaim and retell our stories and allow the food to be evidence of our existence, and allow the food to assist with the processes of regeneration that is regenerating, our cells down to the molecular level, right? To the spiritual level, because, ultimately what it's going to take is us decolonizing our taste buds.
That's amazing. And I think it's so awesome because, a lot of times in these communities, in our communities, people think, oh, you're eating plant-based, you're eating a certain way, you're doing certain things. That's something like white folks do, not people of color, right? And so it's really bringing it back to the true roots,
Yes.
which for me feels like more affirming, more long-term, for people once they make that connection. And so that brings me back full circle to Adriana and the work that you're doing, because you started off with talking about how, oftentimes people think, oh, if you're not feeling well, you have to medicate in some way. But really, like, we're seeing that ancestral medicine, like the plant-based food and indigenizing movement that Claudia's working on, the cannabis, like the movement, the physical movement that Dania's working on, like all these things are part of like a whole kind of centering around wellness. So let's come back to the work that you're doing. And, especially for Latinx communities, I think it's really tough for people to feel like therapy is for them. A lot of times you hear like, oh, you have to be crazy to, be okay with going to therapy. And so what do you do to kind of demystify that ideology?
So I think normalizing it through sharing our stories. There's a lot, from what I've discovered of being in the field, a lot of secrecy, in which I think that secrecy is just part of our culture, but we've taken it on into therapy. Now we don't know, if a family member's in therapy until down the road, because of all of that shame and stigma that has been carried intergenerationally, culturally. So I think one of the biggest things that has been very healing for our communities have been just realizing that people are going to therapy and that it's okay, and that people are using therapy as preventative measures, not necessarily for like moments of crises only, or because they are being classified as crazy, for having mental breakdowns or something like that. No, because it's just genuinely a healthy thing. So, I think not only sharing our stories and our narratives, but also educating the community on what therapy is. And there's also been a lot of fear of therapy because therapists are mandated reporters, in which there's a lot, behind that. And we know that we come from a culture that has used abuse as a form of discipline. And that is because of unaddressed trauma. So also through the in-person services, it's educating about other actions that we can take on our younger generations for disciplinary measures that don't involve physical punishment. And that way therapy can be embraced a little bit more in those communities. There is still a lot of harm that has been done in former years from therapists. So we're still working our way to kind of mend those wounds.
Yeah. And what advice would you give to community members to start to kind of tap into some of the you know, some of us have deeply rooted trauma that we're working through, and we might not even know that it's there, but it is. So what advice would you give to community who maybe aren't ready to take the full leap to start seeing a therapist, but maybe can start kind of figuring out ways to tap into sort of that mirror, to look deeper within?
I think we also all kind of know because of our instincts, but we are also conditioned to go against our instincts. So I invite anyone listening to really embrace your instincts. Listen to yourself, listen to that gut, and listen to your body, because your body is telling you something. Our bodies are messengers, right? And we often choose to, just ignore it, use it as a machine, and just push, go, because maybe we're in survival mode also. And that's a symptom of unaddressed trauma as well in some cases. So I think reflecting and taking care of your body first for trauma is, I take the bottom up approach with this for healing, because we can talk about interventions for the mind and the thoughts, but if we are not giving our bodies attention and nurture, then our bodies are going to keep retriggering our minds, and we're going to keep having either these flashbacks or intrusive feelings that we're going to lose control from, which may be where we're at now. So one of the biggest things is just tuning into your body. Maybe, for homework, you can look up on YouTube a body scan meditation. And so that you kind of just start learning how to go inward. And that can also be very scary. So taking that in doses, just bit at a time, can be very helpful. Noticing your breath, right? Usually in a day, are you not giving your breath any attention, or are you able to take deep breaths? Does it hurt? Because sometimes it could hurt or be uncomfortable, because you're holding in so many feelings that you haven't processed. Mm-hmm. And we can begin processing little by little on our own, but we have to be aware of what we need help with. And the last piece is in just asking for help.
Yeah, thank you so much, each of you, for the work that you're doing. It's so important, especially in our communities, to make sure that we're, like you're saying, even if it's like this nonlinear approach, that somewhere along the bumpy road, we find each other and can help navigate through this life. So I appreciate you all so much and the work that you're doing. We got to keep it up. Thank you so much.